Hello and welcome to World Cup Rewind. We now turn our attention to the edition that took place in 2015. Remember, India are going into this tournament as the defending champion, and it's the second time that Australia and New Zealand would be hosting the Cricket World Cup. The first time around, it wasn't really the way that the Indian team would have wanted the World Cup to really turn out for them. It was a World Cup to forget for the Indian team. This time they go in as defending champions. And how is it that this particular World Cup goes for them? With me is Rajdeep Sardesai. Rajdeep, before I get into the Indian journey, what's the first thing that you remember about this World Cup?
The first thing I remember about the 2015 World Cup is Brendan McCullum. You know, he's the flavor of the season at the moment. He's Baz Ball. People are talking about how McCullum has changed the face of Test cricket, English Test cricket in particular. McCullum changed World Cup cricket in a way in 2015, much like Jayasuriya and Kalu Witharna did in 1996, or Martin Crowe, another New Zealander, did in 1992. Every World Cup has one player who leaves an imprint by trying to change the way white ball cricket is played. And my memory is of that New Zealand team playing the most fearless brand of cricket that I've seen. Unfortunately, it's not a memory of the Indian cricket team. If it's an Indian cricket team memory, it's not a nice one. I'll tell you why later in the show. What is that Indian memory that I feel troubled about later in the show?
The one bright bit is, if you remember that 100 that Virat Kohli gets, back-to-back hundreds in Adelaide, you know, it's like a breath of fresh air. You have this young batter who's now emerging as one of the stars of international cricket, has the audacity to say, no, it's a big total, but we'll go for it. He tries to chase that in that Adelaide game. But then comes the shocker in the Melbourne game. Mahendra Singh Dhoni, the captain, plays the game, interestingly does the press conference, and media asks him all the questions there is to ask about the test match, goes back into the dressing room, and about half an hour later you get a press release in your mailbox saying he has announced his retirement from Test cricket. And after that you can't ask him any questions because the press conference is done. So that's the memory of the test matches that happened before the World Cup was to start.
Now, I'm glad you brought the parallels between 92 and 2015, because I think when you go on a long test tour in Australia, the last thing you want is then another World Cup after that, because you're just not fresh. Australia, big grounds, they will grind you down in Test cricket, and they were formidable Test cricket teams. So you're going with a sense of fatigue into a World Cup. I saw that in 92, a World Cup that I saw many of the Test players who played one-day cricket were tired. And in 2015, the one player who was fresh in a way was Virat Kohli, because he was in the form of his life. That innings in Adelaide will go down, particularly chasing fourth innings, as one of the greatest innings of all time. He was in a way to the 2015 team what Sachin Tendulkar was to the 92 team. These were emerging as legends of the game. Sachin, of course, much younger. Virat had played a bit of cricket, but I think Virat Kohli arrived in international cricket with a bang in 2014-15 with that series. He'd had a terrible tour of England, goes to Australia, and the Australian wicket suited Virat's style of play. You know, the ability to hit on the rise, the ability to play well on the back foot. Virat Kohli was the supreme player, but you cannot win a World Cup on one man's back. And you mentioned Mahendra Singh Dhoni. I'm a great fan of Dhoni, but I think that's the one occasion, Nikhil, that Dhoni got wrong. You don't retire in the middle of a series, leaving your team floundering. I think Dhoni should have completed that series. So be it if you lose the series, but you don't give up in the middle of a test series. That's my view, contentious, but for a cricketer who's always been known for his astute timing, I think Dhoni got that one wrong.
Just to give you a bit of a context, there was a 15-odd day gap between India were to play the first game and after the tri-series got over, and all Indian players were asked to decide for themselves what they want to do. So you were free to go holiday wherever you wanted to go, and MS Dhoni at the time had the chance to come back home. Now, this is the first press conference I attend, and a little birdie tells me on the day of the press conference that he's been blessed with a baby girl. And MS Dhoni is on tour at the point, and I remember it very clearly because I'd heard it through some other source not related to cricket. And in the press conference, I asked him that question. And you know what the question was? I said, MS, what I'm getting to hear from back home, is it true? That's all I asked him. And he nods his head and says yes. And then just quickly it becomes breaking news and you get to know. And at that time, arguing with the rest of the cricket journalists that, listen, he's become a father for the very first time. There's a big gap between, their first game and they're only having warm-up games. All he needs to do is just take a flight, a business class seat, get home, be there for 2-3 days, see his newborn daughter, and then come back. And I'm like, as a father of a young girl myself, I'm saying, I would do exactly that. He doesn't. But it's only later do I realize maybe he had his mindset, maybe he didn't want to leave the team midway, go there and come back. Maybe he was thinking about the plan of what the team must do, because from there on, they do have a good time leading up to that semi-final, which we'll get to a little later.
Look, I've always thought MS Dhoni, the test cricketer, very different from MS Dhoni, the white ball cricketer. When he's playing white ball, even as captain, he seems far more in control. So maybe test cricket had worn him down, which is why he decided to quit midway through the game. He did it without fuss, which is good. I only believe that's not the time to leave your team. I'm glad he stayed back, despite his daughter's birth.
Then India get into that tournament after having a very disappointing series. And then comes another bad news. On the eve of India's first game in Adelaide, I remember, and there was breaking news, Ishant Sharma is ruled out of the World Cup. We only get to know later that he was nursing an injury. There was an injury that he suffered while playing that Melbourne Test match, that same Test match after which MS Dhoni decides to retire. But he says he has a very high threshold of pain, so continues to play the next Test match too. But that does more harm than good. And then eventually he's ruled out. So then India is going in with Mohammad Shami. It's going in with an Umesh Yadav. You still know that these are the two bowlers you can rely on. And a little less experienced Mohit Sharma in that. So that's India's fast bowling attack. There is no Ishant Sharma. And that's another jolt that India has. And to add, to the troubles that the Indian team was at the time going through, the draw was made in such a way, and this was a common discussion amongst all journalists, and this is what the cricket writing was all about at that time, that is the draw not favorable to India, because their two toughest games were right at the start. You play Pakistan in your first game, next up is South Africa. From there on, it was a bit of an easy route after that. But your two biggest games are right at the start. How do you look at it? Does it give the Indian team time to get into the groove? Does it get the Indian team time to get over the disappointment that they've had at the tri-series? Many thought that if you had got a few easy games, just a couple of wins under your belt, then take on Pakistan, then take on South Africa. That wasn't to be. That's how the schedule was. So India gets into this game versus Pakistan. And as it turns out, the schedule wasn't really bad, worked out for them.
Look, there is something about India and Pakistan in these World Cup games, at least at that time, which suggested India were the favourites. That was not a great Pakistan team. If you go through the Pakistani teams over the years, they've always had 3 or 4 match winners. That team just didn't have those kind of cricketers who were going to turn a match. There was the usual internal turmoil within Pakistan cricket ahead of a World Cup. Misbah-ul-Haq, of course, is the captain of the team. But you sensed that Pakistan were vulnerable early on in the tournament. Because the flip side of it is, if the Pakistanis get into a tournament, play more matches like they did in 1992, adjust to Australian conditions, they can be formidable. They had a couple of good fast bowlers, the likes of Wahab Riaz. But at the end of the day, India was a much better team than Pakistan. My memory of that, of course, is watching it on TV and just wondering, how did this large ground accommodate only Indians and Pakistanis? I could barely see an Australian around. And that is how cricket had changed compared to 1992. 1992, you'd get, 200, 300 Indian fans. But by 2015, Indians across the world were obsessed with cricket, and the Bharat Army would land in any corner of the world. So it was like playing in a home match. One stand with Pakistanis, but 90% of the crowd Indians.
It's interesting you talk about the crowds, because on the eve of that game in Adelaide, I seldom feel any pressure, because your work keeps you occupied. You can't really get into the pressure or the fever that's around you, because, as I said, you're so occupied with your work. But that is that one game I clearly remember. I did not sleep that night, primarily because India time, our prime time, was very late, almost early morning in Australia, and I had to do the show. Mr. Gavaskar was our expert, and we were just next to each other in terms of hotels. So he said, I remember it was post midnight, must have been at 1 o'clock that I had to do the show. So I said, I'll come down, pick you up from your hotel, which is just next door walking, and bring you to my hotel where we had done the setup in the balcony with the Adelaide street behind. I remember picking up at 1 o'clock, There were loads of Indians and Pakistani fans on the street, so it was busy. Adelaide, as you know, by 8 o'clock it's dead, but that night Adelaide at 1 o'clock it's buzzing. We do the show, I go to drop him back, it's about 2 o'clock, still it's buzzing, and when I get to interact with a few fans, a few Pakistani fans and Indian fans, I think that's when it starts sinking in that it's a big game tomorrow. It is a big game, it's India, Pakistan, everyone has their permutations, combination, what's going to happen, and so that's the night that I don't sleep really well, because I'm anxious, because I know it's a big India versus Pakistan game.
You were not playing, Nikhil. Think about Ahmed, think about Virat Kohli carrying all the pressure and playing a remarkable innings. You know, Virat was at the peak of his form, and you know, the Pakistani attack was just not good enough for him. I think the other big player for India at that start of that tournament was Shikhar Dhawan.
Yep.
You know, Shikhar is the big change from 2011 to 2015. Then you had Gautam Gambhir, Virender Sehwag, two other Delhiites. Now you've got another Delhiite who also comes with that same big match temperament. You know, I'll give it to Dilliwalas. I'm a Mumbaiker, but I'll give it to Dilliwalas. Many of them had big match temperament, particularly when they played Pakistan. They seem to raise their level, call it the Punjabiyat, the North Indian syndrome. Shikhar was a bit like that, and I think him plus Dhoni, both Dilliwalas, running hard between the wickets, looking at the bowlers in the eye. I don't think the Pakistanis could cope up with the intensity that India brought to that game.
Well, that's absolutely right. 300 is what India put on board, and from there on it's very tough for Pakistan to chase it down. It's an aging side. You talk about Misbah-ul-Haq being the captain. You've got a Yunus Khan there. You've got a Shahid Afridi there, but it's an aging side. They're not the same that they were maybe about 5, 6, 7 or even a decade before that. It's an easy win. They get about 230 odd and India cruise to the victory. So now the pressure is off. It's a good start for India. They've started well after the disappointment of the Test series, the Tri-Series. They win that first game, so that first box is ticked. Then again a big game at the biggest cricket ground at the time in world cricket, at the MCG. It's the formidable South Africans that come up against the Indian team, and once again the Indian team gets a 300 plus total. And it's very interesting, we'll see that will be the common bit that we'll discuss, that you talk about Shikhar Dhawan. So it was the top three, that 2013 Champions Trophy, dependent on the top three, exactly that. So if versus Pakistan you have a Virat get 100, versus South Africa, big game, you this time have a Shikhar Dhawan get you that 100. And so India get 300 plus. And you thought that Pakistan game was easy. This one's easier because nobody at that time saw this coming. 170 odd is what South Africa can manage. You win by a massive margin of 130 runs.
And the big difference is, while Pakistan was an aging team, this was a South African team in many ways, perhaps the favourites to win the title. Yeah. I remember doing a show ahead of the World Cup and I picked my favourites, the South Africans. I thought, you know, Cinderella story, always have missed the big opportunity. This was their occasion to shine. The wickets would suit them. A.B. de Villiers, Faf du Plessis, Dale Steyn, all of them possibly, you know, at the top of their game, particularly A.B. de Villiers, you know, this dazzling cricketer. And I actually sensed if there was one team that could win the World Cup, it was the South Africans. For the Indians, therefore, to beat them by that margin suggested this team India was doing better than we had expected. Given the disappointments in the run-up to the tournament, 2 wins in 2, India was flying.
They were flying indeed. And after that, they got those easy games. They had to travel a lot. The Indian team, you know, they had to go to Perth, and I had to travel with the team. So you had one long flight going to the other side of Australia. It would feel like you're traveling internationally. After the game in Perth, India goes all the way to New Zealand now to play the 2 games that they had to play in New Zealand. Again, a very long flight. I remember, you know, being on one of those flights, because very long flights. There was Saurav Ganguly in one of the flights that I was traveling, and he was kind enough, the business class seat next to him was empty. So he came in to the cattle class, saw me sitting there, said, why don't you come, I have a seat empty next to me. So courtesy him, got to fly some business class as well in that long flight from Perth to New Zealand. But Indian team, as you mentioned, flying. Easy games, you won against the UAE, Zimbabwe, you even had the West Indies, India beat all of that. So at that point, you knew that India were cruising, they were undefeated. The other standout bit, Rajdeep, because I spoke about the Indian fast bowling, Ishant Sharma had been ruled out. You had a Mohit Sharma, a relatively inexperienced Shami, and there was Umesh as well. Every victory that they had from there on, every time they got the opposition all out. So they picked up 10 wickets in every game, and that was proving to be their success mantra.
You know, you're making it out to be, first of all, as if traveling through Australia is, you know, a huge burden. Nikhil had a lovely time in Australia. It's one of the countries that you always want to go and watch cricket because the grounds are magnificent, large but magnificent. The people love their cricket, intense about the game, great food, great wine. It's the kind of place to go and watch cricket. So I think you're exaggerating your problems there, but you're right. I think the one thing about MS Dhoni's captaincy, and that's why I think he is an outstanding white ball captain, he knows when to press the right buttons. He does it in 20 overs, he does it in 50 overs. And one of the ways to press the right buttons is to pick up wickets. So Dhoni, as a white ball captain, has looked for bowlers who can pick wickets in 50 overs and 20 overs, even if you look at his performance with Chennai Super Kings. So I think that is a standout feature of Mahendra Singh Dhoni. And you know, many of us thought at the time that this could well be his last tournament as World Cup captain. As it turned out, he played one more. But the truth of the matter is, Dhoni was a special captain, and I think that lifted the side in those early games.
Couple of incidents before we turn our attention to the quarterfinal, because India are cruising at the moment. Couple of incidents I remember, because the Indian team had no trouble on the cricket field. There was a bit of a trouble that happened off the field, and this is a story that I'll narrate to you. It became big headlines. So there is a practice session in Perth, and we all reach the practice session. It's in one of the college grounds. The practice session gets over, and there is a Virat Kohli, a young, you know, angry Virat Kohli in that time. You know, he was an upcoming cricketer, and he comes out and he notices a journalist and has a go at him, you know, and everyone's like taken aback. What's happening here, you know? And even the journalist is taken aback. And then he goes inside of the dressing room, and then after some time there's a manager with the team. He comes out and apologizes to the journalist. As it turns out, it's a case of mistaken identity. So there was another journalist who had written a story about his alleged affair at the time with a Bollywood actress who eventually goes on to become his wife. And he thinks this is the journalist who had done it. It's not. And you know, he gives it off to him. It later turns out that the journalist was on tour but hadn't come for practice that day. And it became such a big story that I still remember Mr. Gavaskar, who was our expert, a day after it became headlines in all newspapers, saw the two of them walking together and said, I must click a picture with the two of you. So he had one of them on his left and the other on her right. And I still remember, I still have that picture with me. So that was that one story that happened. The other moment that I'll never forget, because you know there were other games going on, and certain times, Rajdeep, you know, other than India, there's certain things, knocks or spells that stay in your mind. And I think the one from that World Cup was Wahab Riaz. You mentioned him to Shane Watson in that Australia game. It was a game that Australia won by 7 wickets, but that hostile spell in Adelaide to Shane Watson was outstanding. I'd love to know your memories of that spell. I'll just tell you what happened. He was fined after that spell, and we had Brian Lara as one of our experts. And you know what he said? Because he had said a thing or two and was a bit animated while bowling to Shane Watson. And Brian Lara, I remember on air, it became headlines after that. He said on air, he's like, you know, that's what a fast bowler is supposed to do, intimidate the batsman. And you know what I'll do? If he's been fined by the ICC, tell me how much he's been fined. I would want to pay that fine for him. Because that's the spell I'll remember for a very
I remember that spell, quarterfinals. So it's a knockout game. Remember, this is a tournament, 14 teams. Afghanistan coming to play the World Cup for the first time. And it was wonderful to see the Afghans at the World Cup. But then you're in the quarterfinals, 4 teams from each group. So it's knockout. Pressure, you're the host team. You're expected to win. The Pakistanis don't score very much. As a result, you would have thought the Australians would win in a canter. And suddenly comes Wahab Riaz. You see, the one thing about the Pakistanis, and you'll see that in World Cup 2023, there will be that one bowler. It could be a Naseem Shah, it could be a Shaheen Shah Afridi, it could be a Haris Rauf. On their day, when they're in the mood, there's no better sight in cricket than a Pakistani fast bowler at his best. And there was that catch at fine leg. I still remember Shane Watson struggling against Wahab Riaz. Had that been taken, who knows which way it would have gone. Probably the Australians would have still won. But I think Wahab Riaz showed why pace is always a killer in any form of cricket. Not just in red ball, but in white ball too. It was a remarkable spell of fast bowling, brought back memories of Wasim Akram and others, the great Pakistani left-arm fast bowler at his best.
Yeah, Wasim Akram's 2 wicket at the 1992 World Cup final.
Fantastic.
Images that you remember, something to that effect.
That's right. I mean, I think Wasim Akram is in a class of his own. I mean, he is arguably the greatest, unarguably in my view, the greatest left-arm fast bowler the world has produced. Wahab Riaz was good.
Yeah.
He was like one of those characters. When he was good, he was very, very good. When he was bad, he could be terrible. But that day, he was terrific.
Interesting, we talk about Wahab Riaz. I think last episode, 2011 World Cup, we spoke about that semi-final. Yuvraj Singh walking out to bat, the homegrown local boy. I think Wahab Riaz is the one who gets him right up in the first over itself. Okay, now we are getting to the business end. One quarter final you just spoke about. Focusing on India, they are up against Bangladesh. India has always had the wood over Bangladesh, other than that 2007 World Cup. But this is a team that can trouble you or irritate you on certain days. They've got a good batting lineup, decent enough bowlers. And so once again, you need one of your top 3 to put their hands up and get you a big total. And this time, Shikhar has been doing it, Virat has been doing it. This time it's Rohit Sharma who gets 100. But there's a controversy as well.
What is the controversy?
So there is this one particular delivery that Rubul Hussain bowls to him. India is in a bit of a trouble and it's a full toss, very close to the waistline, and he gets caught. I remember he plays that shot. I was at the MCG. In fact, not sitting in the press box. I had my sister-in-law, come to watch that game. So I was sitting in the stands. And I remember him being caught in the boundary and I'm like, that's out. And suddenly you see the umpire signal, no ball. It was a 50-50 decision. India go on to get a big total and then of course Bangladesh crumbled. But it became a major controversy. After that, the Bangladesh cricket president had said that no, this is not done. We're going to boycott it. We're not going to be playing India and I'm going to take this up. I want a appeal filed and so on and so forth. All of these noises were also made.
I remember now, my brother-in-law, Bangladeshi and a cricket fan, actually thought that the game was fixed in some way. You see, the Bangladeshis have always carried a bit of a scar when it comes to the Indians. They somehow feel that India is the big brother. They want to sort of compete with them on equal terms, want to defeat India. And I, in response, say, look, we helped you get liberation in 71. What explains Bangladesh's sort of animus almost on the cricket field towards India? Strong, Bangladesh in Indian conditions will be formidable 2023, but in Australia you'd always expect India to win, and Rohit Sharma is a class act, especially in one-day cricket. In fact, that tournament, India's problem was we had a great top 3, but we didn't have much after number 5. I mean, Mahendra Singh Dhoni was in the second half of his career. Ravindra Jadeja was just emerging as an international cricketer. So I think we missed that killer player at number 6 that we'd have had. Yuvraj in 2011 was, at the top of his game. Had we had a finisher, we might have done a bit better.
Now we turn our attention. Bangladesh game is done. India has won that at the MCG. You head to the Sydney cricket ground. I still remember that day. You're playing Australia. Rajdeep, believe you me, as television journalists, we're there at the ground 3-4 hours before it starts, and you start doing your lives, trying to get fans. I could not for the life of me find an Australian fan. The semi-final is happening in Sydney. I could not find a yellow jersey. All I saw were Indian fans. I mean, you had to struggle to get a yellow jersey. There must have been no more than maybe 400, 500 people out of the 30, 40,000 that were packed into the SCG that may have been wearing the yellow jersey. It was all a sea of blue, yet the game didn't quite turn out that way. It was a Steve Smith masterclass.
Steve Smith masterclass with the bat and a Mitchell Johnson burst with the ball. I think Mitchell Johnson, much like Wahab Riaz, on his day, fearsome. And this was Mitchell Johnson approaching his very best. He would demolish an English team in the Ashes soon after. So Mitchell Johnson at his best, terrific fast bowler. Steve Smith, a remarkable batsman. And he was again, emerging at the peak of his powers, the ability to use his bat in a manner that I haven't seen too many other cricketers. Great hand-eye coordination, perhaps even better in test cricket than one-day cricket, but he had a knack of scoring against India. He'd scored big in the test series, scores big in the one-day cricket. And now I'll come to you where my problem lies. India,
the MS Dhoni
is chasing 300 plus. against Australia.
So just to let you know who got runs, there's Aaron Finch gets 80 odd for Australia, 105 for Steve Smith, quite reminiscent of Ricky Ponting maybe in that World Cup. That's how dominant he was. I remember Maxwell comes and gets a quick fire 20 odd at almost a 200 strike rate. So 328 is what Australia has put on board.
And then you have Mitchell Johnson, and he gets 2 quick wickets, including the critical wicket of Virat Kohli. Virat Kohli, who's had a terrific tour
so
of
you
Australia.
have a decent opening partnership, 30 odd. I think both Shikhar and Rohit get.
Yeah,
Shikhar gets out, then the trouble
it's
starts.
not, when you're chasing 300 plus, you need someone to score a big 100. And you'd think Virat Kohli is the man. He's been the man in form. And I still remember the shot that he gets out to top edging and gets out to Mitchell Johnson. And the camera pans to Anushka Sharma in the stands. And immediately there is a lot of, this is the age of social media. And suddenly there's the targeting of Anushka, almost suggesting as if she was in some way responsible for her, for Virat Kohli getting out. And I thought that was deeply unfair. And I remember writing a blog at the time. And I also am grateful that Virat read the blog somewhere and thanked me later. But I thought I was incensed at the idea, and this is what social media does, and it's done it for the last decade, that they're looking for a villain. And suddenly Virat Kohli, hero until then, is the villain, and worse still Anushka, who has really nothing to do, with what is happening on the field, is also targeted. So that is something I remember about the World Cup, the rise of social media. 2015, Twitter was all over our place, so was Facebook, but Twitter in particular was where you vented. And, there used to be Hindi shows, Match Ka Mujrim, in the...
that started slightly before.
Yeah, much before. But, again created this impression we are looking for a villain. And to think that Virat Kohli should become a villain when he's at the peak of his form simply because he's out to... Mitchell Johnson bowling at his very fastest, not easy to combat. Yes, you might have played a bad shot, but it happens. That's cricket, right? And I think Indian fans, unfortunately, have since then never realized that cricketers are trying their best. You're looking for a villain. I remember Mohammad Shami being made a villain in a T20 World Cup a couple of years ago.
2021.
Not ideal again. So that's my memory. And I wish that camera hadn't panned on Anushka Sharma at that moment.
Okay, I thought you were going to talk about another controversial thing that happened at the time in that game. As you say, the Indian batting order collapses, and then you have an MS Dhoni get 70 odd, a runner ball 70 odd. So I think you were 91 for 3, chasing 328. And at one point I'm sitting in the stadium, and then the fans start to boo. And MS Dhoni, who's loved by one and all, because what they are seeing right now, they know that it's a lost cause. They know that you now can't chase. But at least they expected the Indian team, especially someone like a fighter like MS Dhoni, to go after that total. We know that he always preferred to take it deep, but this wasn't taking it deep. It was run a ball 70 odd he gets. In a way, the kind of impression that you got sitting outside, that he had resigned to the fate that we've lost and just playing along, with the overs getting over. Many thought that fine, if this was a league game and run rate was going to come into play, you could understand. This is a knockout game. Why is he batting like that? He's never spoken about it. He rarely speaks anyway on camera, and that's what happens. And I think that's what also left a bitter taste, in terms of all the Indian fans that turn up. Not just the loss, but the way India lost.
So we've lost the World Cup. India loses the World Cup in that match to the hosts, a very strong Australian team in Australia. So
the one other thing I would want to point out, remember we said the thing that got the Indian team going was the fact that they were picking up 10 wickets in every game. This was the first match that they didn't pick up those 10 wickets.
Absolutely. And I think, the truth of the matter is that this was not a good enough Indian team to win the World Cup.
True.
I think to win the World Cup, you need a core of 6-7 players who peak at the right time. And that didn't happen with this Indian team. That happened in 2011. That didn't happen, unfortunately, in 2015. It happened to some extent in 1983 as well. But, the real memory of the World Cup in terms of a match for me is the other semi-final. It is one of the greatest one-day games that I have seen. When a team scores 298, as the South Africans did, or 300.
No, 280.
280, 290 odd, which is a formidable score to, batting first.
282 if I'm not
It's
mistaken.
a small ground, And you know, in New Zealand, those small grounds can make a difference.
Eden Park in Auckland.
Eden Park in Auckland, you know, it's one of those strange grounds where you have a few short boundaries.
I think it's effectively a rugby ground.
A rugby ground where they
ground.
play cricket.
Yeah.
But you expect that, you know, South Africa, with the kind of formidable bowling lineup led by Dale Steyn, will be able to control the run flow. Ironically, McCullum goes to a, you know, you expect McCullum to go to the fast start, but then a South African-born Grant Elliott plays, you know, are you ever going to think of Grant Elliott as a great World Cup player? No. But he plays the innings of his life in that semi-final. And I remember meeting Dale Steyn many years later, and I was in awe of his bowling. But he bowled a back-of-length ball, 3 runs to go, 2 balls left. Back of length for any batsman is perhaps the place where he has half a chance. And I think Dale Steyn will regret it to this day. Grant Elliott just plays this remarkable shot, hits him out of the ground, and South Africa lose yet again, my favourites for the tournament. And then my heart is with New Zealand, because they've also never won the World Cup. Australia's won it 4 times. You'd like to believe that, you know, this could be New Zealand's World Cup. Sadly, it isn't. Sadly, it isn't.
Yes. So that particular 6 that Rajdeep is talking about, you know, behind long on is where he deposits the ball at Eden Park in Auckland. Interestingly, Rajdeep, that's the shot that Grant Elliott plays. I remember the image of Dale Steyn falling down on the pitch, having lost that match. And what is it with South Africa and heartbreaks in World Cup? But where that 6 landed at Eden Park in that stadium in Auckland, they've marked it. They've mentioned that this is where that ball landed, hit by Grant Elliott. And out of all the seats, I think they're all grey in colour at the stadium. That one is coloured green, the colour of the South African team. So they've coloured it green with a plaque there mentioning that this is where the ball came to rest after the 6 hit by Grant
Interesting,
Elliott.
because now I must ask the Mumbai Cricket Association, have you done the same with that spot where MS Dhoni hit that 6? Which won us the 2011 World Cup. I hope you'll do it. Give me that seat. I'll sit there for this year's semi-finals in Mumbai. So maybe that. But that's, you know, the great thing about both Australia and New Zealand, this ability to, the sense of remembrance, that you don't forget these special moments. So Grant Elliott's special moment, I think Dale Steyn almost cried. If he didn't, I'd be very surprised. And it was sad. But then the final. And, you know, this is India versus Pakistan on a smaller scale, New Zealand versus Australia. I think the Australians still believe England are their first enemy number 1, but they don't have, there's no love lost across the Tasman Sea.
I have often referred to this final as the shortest final in the history of the World Cups. That's not by time, that's not by the number of overs that may have been played, because I think Australia, Pakistan would have been shorter in 99, but I still say it's the shortest final. Why? Because it was over in the 5th ball of the 1st over. It was done. The final was done. I was sitting there without any pressure this time. India's out, so we really don't have to do too much work, just the bare minimum of covering the World Cup final at the MCG. So enjoying it from the press box, and it's being built up as this match that McCullum is going to go against the Australian fast bowlers, and McCullum, playing that aggressive brand of cricket, tries to whack Stark outside the park, and he's out. And that's pretty much, we all know, sitting there in the press box, there's a collective ooh or a ah that goes into the press box. Everyone knows the game is done, and from there on it's a below par total that New Zealand get. In fact, your friend Grant Elliott, once again is the highest scorer, gets 80 odd once again, just as he had got in the semi-final, but was never going to be enough for that strong batting lineup that Australia had.
That's right. Steve Smith takes the Australians to a relatively easy victory. Michael Clarke scores runs, and there is a backdrop there as well. Because if you remember, in the build-up to the Indian Test series, just before that, you have the tragedy of what happens to Phil Hughes.
Yes.
Hit on the head in a domestic match, dies tragically. So an Australian cricketer, a test mate, a younger brother of Michael Clarke, as he called him, dies ahead of that test series. Clarke plays that first test, scores 100, and then leads his team to a World Cup victory. Dreams are made of this, and in a way it shows the highs and lows. Australia started that season for them with the tragedy of Phil Hughes, ends it with the World Cup in their hands. That's life. You know, the World Cup is a bit of that. There is a lot of emotion. We discussed how Sachin Tendulkar lost his father in the middle of a World Cup in '99, comes back to score a century. That's sport, and that's why we love it so much.
Okay, and it was a perfect swan song for Michael Clarke, the captain of the Australian team. You knew that this was going to be his last World Cup. In fact, many thought he could have carried on, but he said, no, that's it, done. And it was also the, sort of passing of the baton, because Michael Clarke, the top scorer with 70 odd. Smith, as we said, this star for Australia, gets a half century there, is not out till the end. Australia once again showing their dominance in white ball cricket, win that World Cup. It's the last time you see Michael Clarke play for Australia.
And also the sadness in a way is that we haven't won a major ICC trophy in this entire period. The last big win for India is 2013 Champions Trophy.
A
so
couple
that's
of years
10 years.
before.
So in a way 2015 was a disappointment, but we've had a series of disappointments since then. So that's again life. Top of the tree 2011. Hopefully 2023 will be the start of a new dawn.
All right, completely out of time on this episode of World Cup Rewind. This, of course, was our penultimate episode. Coming up next time around will be the 2019 World Cup, and there's no suspense over that. Just as India's campaign got over in the semi-final this time, it was similar for the Men in Blue in 2019, but plenty of other stories to discuss. We'll see you around next time.
Namaskar.
What a great day for Indian cricket.